This video is a little snippet of our larger course, Typography for Invitation Designers, and it'll teach you all about using principles of typography in your wedding invitation designs. I hope that you enjoy this video and that you'll give us a like, subscribe, or comment to tell us what you think. And if you want to elevate and transform your invitation business, please join us in Stationery School, which is a monthly education platform designed just for stationery designers to help you achieve huge things. The overall goal of good type design is making it simple to digest. Yes, you also want to make your overall design beautiful, and there are cases like this one where the design can be beautiful even when it's really difficult to digest. But when it comes to stationery design, we almost always want function to be a key factor. Think of grandma. Will she be able to read this invitation, or will she be really, really confused? There are a ton of tiny subconscious factors that go into how someone digests an invitation, so how can you use type to your advantage? You should start by laying out your type on a grid of sorts. Invitations typically don't have a ton of information, so this won't be as obvious to you, but you've likely already been doing this visually, even if it wasn't 100% on purpose. So here's an example of a gridded invitation. You can see all these are lining up, even though we have some extra text down here. We make sure the lines are the same. We make sure this is exactly as wide as this. We make sure that the top of this line comes onto the top of these letters so that we don't have anything kind of janky or off-putting to the eye, even if it's just subconscious. One big thing in the gridding phase is you'll focus on your alignment. I talked about this a lot in the free course on composition and layout, which is linked below if you haven't taken it yet. The main point with alignment is that you're going to either get a really hard edge where it's aligned like this one on the left, or a more organic edge like this one over here. You actually get two organic edges when things are center aligned, which is very common for invitations, but is actually technically harder to read than left or right aligned text. Organic edges are going to create what's called a rag, which is basically the shape that you make with all of these different lines together. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but you should pay attention to what your rag looks like, as it will direct your eye in a positive direction, or it might accidentally scream yikes on a subconscious level. So for instance, I have added Antenna Club to this actual venue just to show you that this is kind of a yikes rag, because this one line is way longer. It's even longer than the names, which should be the most important. And it kind of brings your eye out here first, which is not what we want to do. The actual name is just Pelican Hill Resort. And this creates a much nicer rag because everything kind of flows more organically and looks pretty cohesive. I also talked about hierarchy a little in the free course, but it's extra important when it comes to type. And I see a lot of designers screw this up. Hierarchy is used to highlight the most important parts of your text, and it makes things scannable and easy to see what's important on this piece of paper you're reading. Again, just think of grandma. The biggest mistake I see is often using a ton of different hierarchies and types of emphasis on different pieces of the suite. This makes your suite look like each piece was designed individually, which is usually the case when this happens, as opposed to together as a cohesive unit. You should only use one or two types of emphasis max and keep your structures the same across the whole piece. So like for this piece, we have a hierarchy set where the date is in this bold font, the names are in a slightly different one because those are important, but not as important as exactly when everything's happening. And then the least important information, which is the address, is going to be in italics, which is a little bit less important. So that's a set hierarchy throughout this entire piece. And then we've used that same emphasis, same exact hierarchy for their RSVP and their website at the bottom. Throughout the suite, we've actually used this different font in the same size. So it's 21-point font. You'll see that throughout their whole suite, like Nevada and California, Kindly Reply, and their names are in the same font and 21-point. And then we have a slightly lower hierarchy that we've used for all these names, which is a 12-point version of that font. That's this same cocktail attire. We want to keep that really consistent. And then we've actually made this one a little bit bigger just because this map is the showcase piece for their suite. My branding guidelines have clear settings for headlines, subheadings, paragraph, and even callouts. We use my Sapphire script, of course. Your invitations should have these clearly assigned too. Typically, names are going to be the most important part of the text, so they should be highlighted, but you can also focus on card titles, the name of the venue, or even the date, like in some save the date designs. That's the highest level of hierarchy. You should not have your eye going straight to a word that doesn't matter at all. And if you add a lot of different hierarchies and text sizes, colors, alignments, etc., then it's really hard to see what's important, and that makes everything on the design become kind of unimportant. Legibility is really important too in this regard. It's hard to read things that are jumbled in all different colors and sizes, etc. So here's some tips for the best legibility. Try not to print type in too light of a color. You want to use rich colors for a really good deep print. We'll cover those in the color theory course, but this is an example. This gray would not print as well as this black. It's also harder to read text that's light on dark backgrounds, and those are going to print a little less cleanly, so avoid that for important details. You can see it pretty well here, so if you're using large text or it's high in the hierarchy, it's okay, but for really small text, it's going to print a little bit weird and be harder to read if you do the white text on a flood background. 3, make sure your text is large enough for grandma to read clearly. I don't usually go below 10-point font, but fonts have different levels of legibility depending on a lot of factors, so it never hurts to just print it out at size and do a quick check. Things that are extra important, like venue names, should definitely be large enough to read. Things that have more context to them, like dates and times, can sometimes be a little bit smaller because it's still easy to figure out if you have a limited number of things that this word could possibly be. Or you could go smaller for filler words like invite you to celebrate their wedding. Script fonts also need to be much larger than 10-point, but your exact sizing will depend a lot on the specific font. And then my 4th tip is just adding a stroke if you're having trouble with legibility or you have really thin type. So for instance, the thins on this is Dido. It's a really common font, but the thins can kind of print weird and be really tough to read. But if you just add a quick stroke, this is just a 0.15 stroke, and it makes those thins a lot easier to read and still doesn't really detract from the overall vibe of the font. You can also liven up your type by using glyphs. These are going to help you with international type. If you're going to need a type in a different language, your choice of typeface might be slightly limited. So just pay attention to language compatibility when you're choosing your fonts. I have a full tutorial on using glyphs linked below, but just know going over here to the glyphs panel or clicking type glyphs. But just know that this is how designers access swashes, alternate characters, accents, special characters, or things like Roman numerals if those are programmed into your font. A couple of final points to make on using type in your designs is that you should never underestimate the value of white space. I find that less is more when it comes to text and try to limit myself as much as possible. The opposite of what I do when I'm talking. I get it, I know. Letting the text breathe will help your designs more than it will hurt them. So try not to use 5 words in a space where 2 will suffice unless you need to for functionality. And finally, sometimes you just have to use your eyes, not the math. Here's a great example of a font I use so often where the kerning of this lowercase f and a space after it is totally off. It's probably technically mathematically fine, and the f looks great with other characters, as you can see down here, but because of the white space below the f, and then when you add the space over here, it looks completely off. So I always have to go in and make the space a little bit smaller or adjust the kerning specifically. This can happen with centering or spacing as well, and you have to be aware that sometimes things look better 2 spaces to the left than they do mathematically centered. So this is where you, the designer, can come in and provide real value to your clients, because sometimes you have a font that's got a swash, making everything look a little off center, and you just have to trust your eyes, not the math sometimes.